Hello, Free Jord. I really appreciate you watching and commenting. Now, let's listen to the story.
Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Nicholas. When my wife looked me in the eye and told me she wanted to live for herself, without me, my response changed everything between us forever. I met Dorothy at a professional networking event years ago. She was working in the human resources department for an international organization, and I was just starting my career in financial consulting. When we started talking that night, I was impressed by how ambitious she was and how thoughtfully she spoke about her work. Our courtship, months later, felt natural and healthy. We'd meet for coffee between our busy schedules, go to museums on weekends, and take evening walks where we'd talk about everything from current events to our childhood memories. Dorothy seemed genuinely interested in building something meaningful together, and she was supportive of my career goals while pursuing her own professional development. We got married after dating for 2 years in a small ceremony that felt perfect for both of us. Dorothy moved into the house I'd bought the year before with money I'd inherited from my grandfather. It was a 3-bedroom suburban home with a small yard, but it was completely paid off and represented the kind of stability I'd always wanted to provide for my future family. The first 2 years of our marriage were everything I'd hoped they would be. Dorothy seemed to love the house. She never complained about the house or suggested we needed something bigger or different. Dorothy had her own career and her own income, but she seemed content with our financial arrangement, where I handled the mortgage-free house expenses and she contributed to groceries and utilities. We maintained separate bank accounts, but also opened a joint account for shared expenses and savings. Everything felt balanced and fair. During those early years, Dorothy had friends from work and a few college acquaintances she'd keep in touch with occasionally, but she wasn't particularly social outside of our relationship. She'd go out with coworkers sometimes for happy hour or attend work events, but most of her free time was spent with me or on her own hobbies. I never felt like her friendships were competing with our marriage or causing any tension between us. The woman I married seemed to value our partnership and appreciate the life we were building together. She seemed to understand that marriage meant making decisions together and considering how our choices would affect each other. Around our 3rd year of marriage, Dorothy reconnected with some of her college friends through social media. Both of them had been in her sorority, and they'd apparently been reaching out to old friends and organizing regular meetups in our city. Dorothy was excited about reconnecting with them, and initially, I was happy that she was expanding her social circle again. One, as I found out, was divorced from her second husband and worked as a real estate agent. She was loud, opinionated, and had very strong feelings about marriage in general. According to Dorothy, she felt like she'd wasted her 20s and early 30s trying to make men happy instead of focusing on herself. She was now embracing what she called her independence and encouraging other women to do the same. The other lady, I would also find out, had never been married, but had been through a series of long-term relationships that had ended badly. She worked in event planning and had an active social life that seemed to revolve around going out. She was always organizing group activities and seemed to take pride in being the fun, spontaneous friend who could convince people to drop everything for an adventure. At first, Dorothy's renewed friendships with these people seemed harmless. She'd go out with them maybe once a month for dinner or drinks, and she'd come home with stories about their conversations and updates about their lives. I was glad Dorothy had close female friends to talk to, especially since we'd moved to a new city after marriage, and she'd been somewhat isolated from her support network. But over the course of several months, I started noticing changes in Dorothy's behavior and attitudes that seemed to coincide with her time spent with these friends. She'd come home from their gatherings with new complaints about our relationship that had never been issues before. Suddenly, she'd question why I wanted to know where she was going or when she'd be home, framing normal married couple communication as controlling behavior. Dorothy also started making comments about how some married women we know were too dependent on their husbands, or how certain wives she knew had lost their identities by always prioritizing their families over themselves. These observations felt like she was testing out new ideas about marriage and independence. The most noticeable change was in how Dorothy talked about our future plans. Previously, she'd always used language that included both of us when discussing things. As I noticed, she started talking more about what she wanted to do or accomplish, without automatically considering how those goals would fit into our shared life. I tried to dismiss these changes as a normal part of Dorothy exploring different perspectives. I told myself that all marriages go through phases where partners question things or need space to grow individually. I didn't want to be the type of husband who felt threatened by his wife having close female friends or pursuing her own interests. By our 4th year of marriage, Dorothy's friendship with her old college friends had become a central part of her social life. They were getting together at least twice a week, either for planned activities or spontaneous meetups. Dorothy started staying out later when she was with them, sometimes not coming home until after midnight on weeknight gatherings. The conversations Dorothy brought home from these friendships became more pointed and seemed designed to create conflict between us. She'd share stories about how the divorced one's ex-husband had tried to control her finances, or how the unmarried one had broken up with a boyfriend who didn't want her traveling alone with friends. These stories always came with commentary about how men try to limit women's freedom, and Dorothy would watch my reaction carefully when she told them. Dorothy also started questioning decisions we'd made together early in our marriage, reframing them as examples of me being controlling or traditional in ways that were apparently problematic. Our arrangement, where I handled most of the household expenses, became evidence that I was trying to keep her financially dependent. My preference for us to discuss major decisions before making them became proof that I didn't trust her judgment. The most frustrating part of this period was how Dorothy would bring up these concerns. Instead of sitting down to have honest conversations about things that were bothering her, she'd make passive-aggressive comments or ask loaded questions that felt like traps. If I tried to address her concerns directly, she'd accuse me of being defensive or dismissive of her feelings. Dorothy's behavior outside our home started changing as well. She began posting more frequently on social media, sharing articles about women's independence and relationship equality that felt like indirect commentary on our marriage. When I registered my displeasure with the influence these friends had on her, Dorothy became more secretive with her phone, taking calls from her friends in other rooms or stepping outside to talk. When I'd ask why she's having hidden conversations, she'd accuse me of trying to monitor her friendships. These weren't behaviors I'd ever seen from her before, and they made me wonder what kinds of conversations she was having that she didn't want me to overhear. The arguments between us became more frequent during this time, and they always gradually escalated into bigger issues. She turned minor household disagreements into accusations about my character or our relationship. She'd accuse me of not supporting her friendships if I expressed any concern about how much time she was spending away from home, or if I mentioned that her late nights were affecting our time together. The turning point came during our 5th year of marriage, when Dorothy announced that she wanted to go on a week-long trip to Las Vegas with her unmarried college friends. This wasn't presented as a discussion or a plan we'd work out together. Dorothy told me about the trip as if it were already decided, mentioning that they'd already looked at flights and hotels and were planning to book everything the following week. When I asked about the details of this trip, Dorothy became immediately defensive. She said it was just a fun girls' trip to celebrate one of the friends' birthdays, but that sounded more like an extended party vacation focused on clubbing, drinking, and meeting people. My concerns were about the way she'd made this decision without any discussion with me. A week-long party vacation in Las Vegas, planned without any input from me and presented as non-negotiable, felt like Dorothy was testing how much she could do without considering our relationship at all. I immediately told her why the idea of the trip makes me uncomfortable. Dorothy's reaction was more explosive than anything I'd seen from her before. She accused me of treating her like property and of being insecure and jealous for no reason. She said things that night that sounded nothing like the woman I'd married, using phrases about independence and autonomy that sounded like she was one bitter feminist. Dorothy also started comparing me unfavorably to other men, particularly to one of her friend's current boyfriends, who apparently never questioned her friend's plans or expressed concerns about her choices. She said I was being possessive and traditional in ways that were holding her back from living her life fully. The fight lasted hours, with Dorothy becoming more and more angry that I wouldn't just agree to her trip and apologize for questioning it. What struck me most during that argument was how Dorothy seemed to be enjoying the conflict in some way. She seemed energized by the fight, like she was finally getting to say things she'd been thinking for a long time. The fight ended with Dorothy announcing that she was going on the trip regardless of how I felt about it, and that if I had a problem with that, maybe I needed to examine my own issues around trust and control. She said she was tired of feeling like she had to get permission from me to live her life, and that our marriage shouldn't mean she had to give up her freedom and independence. After that fight, Dorothy stopped speaking to me beyond basic household logistics. She moved into our guest bedroom and began treating me like a roommate she barely tolerated. For weeks, we lived in the same house while maintaining almost complete silence with each other. Dorothy would leave for work before I woke up and come home after I'd already had dinner. On weekends, she'd make plans that kept her out of the house for most of the day. When we did cross paths, she'd respond to any attempts at conversation with one-word answers or by simply walking away. It was clear that she was getting emotional support and validation from her friends while punishing me with silence. I kept expecting Dorothy to cool down and talk things out. I thought this was just an extreme reaction that would pass, just like the others. I genuinely believed she'd come to her senses and realize we could work through this conflict if we could just have an honest conversation about our different perspectives. I started thinking about suggesting couples counseling or planning some kind of gesture that might open the door to communication between us. I researched marriage counselors in our area and thought about ways to show Dorothy that I was willing to work on whatever issues she felt we had. I even considered telling her to go ahead and take the Vegas trip, thinking that maybe I was being too rigid about something that ultimately wasn't worth damaging our marriage over. But Dorothy's behavior during this time made it clear that she wasn't interested in resolving our conflict or finding a compromise. She seemed perfectly content with the Cold War we were having, like she was waiting for me to capitulate completely rather than wanting to find a solution that worked for both of us. The end came on a Thursday evening. I'd been working late on a project that was due the next day. I'd been thinking about coming home and trying once more to have a real conversation with Dorothy about where we stood and how we could move forward. When I walked into our kitchen that evening, I found Dorothy sitting at our dining table with papers spread out in front of her. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring, which I noticed after our fight. She looked like someone who'd already made a decision they were completely comfortable with. Dorothy stood up when she saw me and crossed her arms. She said she was tired of feeling like she had to check in with me or consider my feelings before making decisions about her own life. She said she deserved to be happy, and that meant not being married anymore. The papers on the table were divorce documents. Dorothy had been talking to a lawyer and had already started the legal process of ending our marriage. While I'd been hoping we could work things out, Dorothy had been planning her exit strategy and consulting with legal counsel about how to leave me. My response surprised both of us. Instead of begging or arguing or trying to talk her out of it, I looked at her calmly and told her she could go ahead and live for herself, but not in my house and not on my dime. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Dorothy's mouth actually fell open, like she couldn't process what I'd just said. She'd been so prepared for me to fight or cry or beg her to reconsider that my matter-of-fact response seemed to short-circuit whatever script she'd been following. Dorothy had clearly expected a completely different reaction. She'd thought I'd be devastated, that I'd do anything to keep her, that I'd accept whatever terms she wanted to set for our marriage. She'd probably imagined me agreeing to let her live however she wanted, while still providing her with the security and benefits of being my wife. But I'd reached my breaking point, and something about her cold, calculated delivery had flipped a switch in my mind. I wasn't going to beg someone to stay who'd already emotionally checked out of our marriage. And I definitely wasn't going to let her treat our home like a hotel that she could come and go from whenever she felt like being married. Dorothy's shock at my response quickly turned into anger as she fired back that she was going to take the house. When I explained that the house she'd been living in for 5 years was mine alone, purchased before our marriage with inheritance money, and that her name had never been on any of the ownership documents, She'd assumed that because we were married, she automatically had a claim to half of everything, including our home. Maybe her lawyer had apparently made the same assumption, because as I took the divorce papers to my lawyer, the next day we could spot demands for Dorothy to receive half the value of our house as part of the settlement. When my attorney reviewed the documents, he immediately identified this as a major error that would need to be corrected, since the house was my separate property acquired before marriage. The discovery process revealed the full scope of Dorothy's misconceptions about our financial situation. Her reaction to learning about the house ownership was explosive. She accused me of deliberately hiding information from her and tricking her into believing we owned everything together. She claimed that I'd been financially controlling throughout our marriage by not putting her name on the house deed, even though she'd never asked to be added and had never contributed to the purchase or any major improvements. The legal proceedings stretched on for 14 months, during which Dorothy's attorney tried various arguments to establish some claim to the house. They argued that Dorothy's unpaid household labor had contributed to maintaining the property value, that her financial contributions to utilities and groceries had freed up my income to pay for house expenses, and that she'd been led to believe she would share in the property appreciation. My attorney systematically dismantled each of these arguments with documentation showing that I'd paid all property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs for my separate accounts, that Dorothy's household contributions were normal marital activities that didn't create property rights, and that there was no evidence I'd ever promised to add her to the deed. The court hearings were uncomfortable and sometimes embarrassing, as Dorothy's frustration with the legal process led to emotional outbursts that didn't help her case. She'd interrupt proceedings to accuse me of lying or manipulation, forcing the judge to remind her multiple times about proper courtroom behavior. When the divorce was finalized, Dorothy received her share of our joint savings account, plus the personal items she'd brought into the marriage or purchased with her own money during our marriage. She also kept her car, which was in her name and which she'd been paying for throughout our marriage. Dorothy had hoped for spousal support, but the court determined that our marriage had been too short and that she had sufficient earning capacity to support herself. The judge noted that both parties had maintained separate careers throughout the marriage and that there was no evidence of financial dependence that would justify ongoing support. The total value of Dorothy's settlement was enough to help her transition to single life, but nowhere near the six-figure windfall she'd apparently been expecting when she filed for divorce. My legal costs for the divorce were high. The process had been expensive and emotionally draining for both of us, but the outcome was clear. Dorothy would leave the marriage with her personal assets and her share of what we'd built together financially during our marriage, but she wouldn't be taking any portion of my premarital property. The months following our divorce were a period of adjustment for both of us. I stayed in the house and gradually removed all traces of Dorothy's presence and replacing anything that reminded me of our shared life. It was strange being alone in a space that had been our home for 5 years, but also liberating to not have to walk on eggshells or wonder what mood Dorothy would be in when I came home from work. Dorothy moved in with one of her friends. According to mutual friends, she seemed to be enjoying her newfound independence, going out frequently and posting about her active social life online. For the first few months, I occasionally heard updates about Dorothy through people we'd both known during our marriage. She was apparently dating again and seemed to be embracing the single lifestyle she'd claimed to want so badly. I was glad she was happy and hoped she'd found whatever it was she'd been looking for when she decided our marriage wasn't enough for her. I focused on rebuilding my own life and pursuing hobbies I'd neglected. About 2 years after our divorce was finalized, Dorothy called me on a Tuesday evening. I hadn't heard from her since the final court hearing, and seeing her name on my phone screen brought back a flood of complicated emotions. Against my better judgment, I answered the call. Dorothy's voice was different from what I remembered. She explained that she was having financial difficulties and was hoping I might be able to help her out temporarily. Her settlement money had run out faster than expected because she had quit her previous job, and she was struggling to make rent on her apartment. Dorothy asked if she could borrow some money to get caught up on her bills, promising to pay me back as soon as she found new employment. She mentioned that she'd already asked her friends and family for help, but that everyone else was dealing with their own financial pressures and couldn't assist her. The conversation was surreal, listening to the woman who'd told me she wanted to live for herself and didn't need me, now asking me to rescue her from the consequences of the independence she demanded. Dorothy seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't immediately willing to help, as if our divorce had been a minor disagreement rather than her deliberate choice to end our marriage. When I asked Dorothy why she thought I would lend her money after everything that had happened between us, she said she'd hoped we could still be friends and support each other when needed. She seemed to have completely forgotten her own words about wanting to live without me or the months of cold treatment that had preceded our divorce. I listened to Dorothy's entire request before responding, and then I reminded her of something she'd said to me years earlier. I told her that she'd been very clear about wanting to live for herself without me, and that this was exactly what she was doing now. I explained that her financial problems were the natural consequence of the independence she'd chosen, and that asking me to solve them was inconsistent with the life she'd said she wanted. Dorothy's response revealed that she'd expected our divorce to work differently than it actually had. She thought she could end our marriage, but still maintain access to my financial stability when she needed it. She'd wanted the freedom to make her own choices without considering my feelings, but she'd also wanted the security of knowing I'd be there to help her when those choices didn't work out as planned. When I made it clear that I wouldn't be lending her money or providing any kind of ongoing support, Dorothy became angry in the same way she had during our marriage conflicts. She accused me of being cruel and vindictive, of punishing her for wanting to be happy. She said I was being petty by holding our divorce against her when she was just asking for help from someone who used to care about her. But I'd learned something important during our marriage and divorce process. Dorothy's definition of a relationship was one where she could take whatever she wanted while giving back only what was convenient for her. She wanted to make unilateral decisions about her life while expecting me to support and accommodate those decisions, even when they directly harmed our partnership. I told Dorothy that I wished her well and hoped she'd figure out her financial situation, but that I wouldn't be part of her support system anymore. I explained that she'd made it very clear that she didn't want me in her life, and that I was respecting her choice by maintaining the boundaries she'd established. After that conversation, I blocked Dorothy's number and all her social media accounts. I'd given her one final chance to show that she understood the consequences of her choices, and she'd failed that test by expecting me to rescue her from those consequences. Looking back on my marriage to Dorothy and the way it ended, I can see warning signs that I missed or chose to ignore at the time. Dorothy's gradual shift in behavior didn't happen overnight. It was the result of influences and attitudes that had probably been developing for much longer than I realized. The most important lesson I learned was about the difference between healthy independence in a marriage and the kind of selfish autonomy that Dorothy pursued. Partners in a good marriage maintain their individual identities and interests, while still considering how their choices affect their shared life. Dorothy wanted complete freedom to make decisions without any input from me, while still expecting to enjoy all the benefits of being married. I also learned about the power of toxic friendships to undermine a marriage. Debbie and Kathy weren't just Dorothy's friends. They were actively encouraging her to view our relationship as oppressive and to prioritize her individual desires over our partnership. Dorothy was susceptible to their influence because she wanted permission to be selfish, and they provided that permission wrapped in the language of empowerment and independence. The divorce taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. Dorothy needed to learn that actions have outcomes, and that you can't demand independence while expecting other people to rescue you from the results of that independence. Today, I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who understands that marriage requires mutual consideration and shared decision-making. We both maintain our individual friendships and interests, but we also prioritize our partnership and discuss major decisions together. It's a kind of balanced relationship I thought I had with Dorothy, but which I now realize was always one-sided. Dorothy taught me that love isn't enough if it's not paired with respect and genuine partnership. She may have cared about me in her own way, but she cared more about getting what she wanted than about treating me like an equal partner in our marriage. I'm grateful for that lesson, even though learning it was more painful than I could have imagined. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled Dorothy's request for help, or whether I should have been more compassionate towards someone I'd once loved. My answer is always the same. The most compassionate thing I could do for both of us was to let her live the independent life she demanded, without undermining that independence by continuing to provide support she'd explicitly rejected. Dorothy got exactly what she asked for when she told me she wanted to live for herself, without me. I just made sure she got all of it.